Harold Hank Morrison stood at the edge of the shooting range, his weathered hands gripping a rifle that had seen better days. The old Springfield MY903 looked ancient compared to the sleek modern firearms surrounding it. Other shooters glanced at the 78-year-old veteran with barely concealed amusement, their eyes lingering on his outdated equipment with obvious disdain. The annual Precision Shooting Championship had drawn marksmen from across the country to the Nevada Desert Range. $1 million custom rifles gleamed in the morning sun, their high-tech scopes worth more than most people's cars. Professional shooters adjusted their electronic wind meters and checked their ballistic computers, preparing for what many considered the most challenging long-range competition in America. Hank's rifle told a different story entirely. The woodstock bore countless scratches and dents, each mark a memory from the European theater of World War II. The metal showed signs of careful maintenance but obvious age, and the simple iron sights seemed primitive next to the advanced optics everyone else carried. Several competitors had already asked if he was lost, assuming the old man had wandered into the wrong event. The current record holder, Marcus Sterling, barely acknowledged Hank's presence. Sterling's custom rifle had cost $40,000, and his precision shooting academy had made him wealthy beyond imagination. He held the championship record of hitting a target at 1,047 yards, a feat that had stood unchallenged for 6 decades. Magazine covers featured his perfect technique, and ammunition companies paid him millions to endorse their products. "That's quite a museum piece you've got there, old-timer," Sterling commented with a condescending smile, his entourage of sponsors and media representatives chuckling appropriately. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at the antique gun show down the road." Hank simply nodded politely, continuing his methodical preparation. He had learned long ago that words meant little when actions could speak louder. The other shooters assumed he was some confused veteran living in past glory, unable to accept that modern technology had surpassed anything from his era. What they didn't know was Hank's history with that particular rifle. During the brutal winter of 1944, when Allied forces pushed through the Ardennes forest, that Springfield had saved his life more times than he could count. While other soldiers struggled with frozen bolt actions and jammed mechanisms, Hank's rifle had functioned flawlessly through the worst conditions imaginable. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather, who had carried it through the trenches of World War I. When Hank enlisted in 1943, his grandfather had pressed the rifle into his hands with a simple promise. "This rifle has never let our family down. Take care of it, and it will take care of you." Through the freezing forests of Belgium and the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, that promise had held true. Hank had modified the rifle himself, adjusting the trigger mechanism with skills learned from his father's gunsmith shop. He knew every quirk, every slight deviation, every perfect characteristic of his weapon better than he knew his own heartbeat. The competition rules were simple but brutal. Shooters would attempt to hit targets at increasingly distant ranges, starting at 800 yards and extending to whatever distance remained achievable. Wind conditions in the Nevada desert were notoriously unpredictable, with thermal currents creating invisible obstacles that could throw off even the most carefully calculated shots. Sterling's team had set up elaborate weather monitoring equipment, measuring wind speed, humidity, barometric pressure, and temperature differentials with scientific precision. Computer programs calculated optimal trajectories, accounting for the Earth's rotation and countless other variables that modern technology could measure and predict. Hank's preparation looked primitive by comparison. He wet his finger and held it up to test the wind, just as he had done 70 years earlier in Europe. He studied the heat waves rising from the desert floor, watching how they bent and shifted in patterns only experience could interpret. His eyes tracked the movement of dust particles and tumbleweeds, reading the invisible language of air currents that no machine could fully understand. The younger shooters whispered among themselves, some feeling embarrassed for the old veteran who seemed so out of place among their high-tech equipment. A few suggested that someone should gently encourage him to withdraw before he humiliated himself publicly. The range officials had already prepared explanations for the media about why they had allowed such an obviously outdated participant to compete. But something in Hank's quiet confidence began to intrigue a few observers. The way he handled his rifle showed decades of intimate familiarity, and his movements carried the unconscious precision of someone who had depended on such skills for survival. A military historian in the crowd recognized the significance of the Springfield M1903 and began to realize that this was no ordinary weekend hobbyist. As the morning progressed and the competition began, Hank's calm demeanor remained unchanged. While other competitors adjusted their equipment obsessively and recalculated their settings, he simply waited his turn with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to consequences far worse than losing a shooting competition. The irony was not lost on him that many of these shooters had learned their techniques from military training programs that still taught principles he had helped develop during the war. The fundamentals of breathing control, sight alignment, and trigger squeeze had not changed significantly in 70 years, despite all the technological advances surrounding those basic skills. When the first round began at 800 yards, the modern rifles performed exactly as expected. Computer-guided precision and perfectly manufactured ammunition produced tight groupings that impressed the gathered crowd. Sterling's shot landed within inches of the bull's eye, and his supporters cheered appropriately for the defending champion. Then came Hank's turn. The range fell silent as the old veteran settled into position, his body naturally assuming a stance perfected through countless hours of combat. The ancient rifle seemed to become part of him, an extension of his will, rather than a separate tool requiring conscious control. The shot rang out across the Nevada desert with a sharp crack that echoed off the distant mountains. Through the spotting scope, the target revealed a perfect center hit that brought gasps from the crowd. Hank's ancient Springfield had just matched the performance of rifles costing 50 times more, using technology that predated most of the spectators by several decades. Sterling frowned slightly, assuming the shot was pure luck. Modern precision shooting required consistent repeatability, not single fortunate attempts. The real test would come as the distances increased and the margin for error disappeared entirely. At 1,000 yards, environmental factors would begin to separate the professionals from the amateurs. The second round commenced with targets positioned at 1,200 yards, a distance that challenged even experienced marksmen. Wind patterns had shifted as the desert heated up, creating complex air currents that required constant adjustment. Sterling's team recalibrated their equipment, feeding new data into their ballistic computers and adjusting their scope settings with mechanical precision. Hank observed the changing conditions with the instinctive understanding of someone who had learned to read nature's signs when his life depended on accurate interpretation. He noticed how the heat shimmer changed intensity, how dust devils formed and dissipated in predictable patterns, and how the wind carried different characteristics at various elevations between his position and the target. When his turn came, he made a single minor adjustment to his rifle's position, compensating for factors that no computer program could accurately predict. The shot struck dead center once again, prompting hushed conversations among the other competitors. What had seemed like beginner's luck was beginning to look like something far more impressive. The competition continued through increasingly difficult stages, with targets placed at 1,400, 1,600, and finally 1,800 yards. Each distance eliminated more shooters, as the technical demands exceeded their equipment's capabilities or their personal skills. Sterling remained confident, knowing that his record of 1,847 yards represented the absolute limit of what most shooters could achieve under any circumstances. At 1,800 yards, only 5 competitors remained in contention. The target appeared as a tiny speck against the desert hillside, barely visible even through high-powered scopes. Wind conditions had become treacherous, with thermal updrafts and crosswinds creating an almost impossible shooting environment. Sterling's shot landed 3 inches from center, still an exceptional performance that drew appreciative nods from knowledgeable observers. 2 other competitors managed hits within the scoring rings, though well outside the optimal zone. The 4th shooter missed entirely, his bullet disappearing into the desert without finding its mark. Then came Hank's turn at the distance that would determine whether his earlier success represented genuine skill or extraordinary fortune. The crowd had grown larger as word spread about the old veteran's unexpected performance, and television cameras captured his methodical preparation routine. He spent long minutes studying the target through his simple iron sights, watching how heat waves distorted its outline and noting the subtle changes in wind direction indicated by dust patterns and vegetation movement. His breathing settled into the rhythm he had learned during countless dawn ambushes in European forests, when patience meant survival and haste meant death. The shot seemed to hang in the air forever before finding its mark with a metallic ping that carried clearly across the desert silence. The spotter called out the result with obvious amazement. "Dead center hit!" For the first time since the competition began, Sterling looked genuinely concerned. His 60-year record was about to be challenged by a weapon and shooter that represented everything modern precision shooting had supposedly surpassed. The irony was not lost on anyone present that technology costing hundreds of thousands of dollars was being outperformed by a rifle that had cost less than $50 when it was manufactured. The final stage would test the absolute limits of human marksmanship. Targets were placed at progressively increasing distances until only one shooter remained capable of making accurate hits. Sterling had set his record at 1,047 yards during perfect conditions with carefully prepared ammunition and months of practice on the specific range. Today's conditions were far from perfect. Desert winds gusted unpredictably, and heat distortion created visual obstacles that challenged even the most advanced optical systems. The pressure was enormous, with media coverage and significant prize money attracting attention from the international shooting community. Sterling's first attempt at breaking his own record fell short when atmospheric conditions caused his bullet to drift slightly off course. His expensive equipment had performed flawlessly, but nature had introduced variables that even the most sophisticated computers could not perfectly predict. Hank's approach remained unchanged by the mounting pressure and attention. He had learned long ago that external circumstances could not be allowed to affect internal focus. During the war, German snipers had taught him that emotional control was just as important as technical skill when lives hung in the balance. He studied the target at 1,850 yards, noting how it seemed to dance and shimmer through the heat waves rising from the desert floor. His aged eyes had lost some acuity over the decades, but his mind retained the ability to process complex environmental information and translate it into precise shooting adjustments. The rifle felt completely natural in his hands, its familiar weight and balance unchanged since those desperate days in Belgium when accurate shooting meant the difference between returning home and joining the countless young men who would never see their families again. Every scratch and dent on the wooden stock represented a memory, a moment when this weapon had served faithfully when failure was not an option. As Hank settled into his shooting position, the desert fell completely silent, except for the whisper of wind across sand and sagebrush. Even Sterling's supporters held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary that would challenge everything they thought they knew about precision shooting. The veteran's finger found the trigger with the same gentle pressure he had used to eliminate German machine gun nests and protect his fellow soldiers during the advance through France. Time seemed suspended as decades of experience and instinct combined into a single perfect moment of focused intention. The bullet left the ancient Springfield's barrel with a velocity that had not changed since 1944, following a trajectory calculated not by computers, but by 7 decades of accumulated wisdom. For what seemed like an eternity, the only sound across the Nevada desert was the fading echo of the shot, while dozens of pairs of eyes strained to see the impact at nearly 1,900 yards. Through the high-powered spotting scope, the range official's voice carried across the silence with obvious disbelief. "Perfect center hit at 1,863 yards. New record." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, while Sterling stood frozen in shock. His carefully maintained record had just been shattered by a weapon that belonged in a museum, fired by a man old enough to be his grandfather. The irony was overwhelming. 6 decades of technological advancement had been surpassed by equipment and techniques from World War II. Hank calmly set his rifle aside and walked toward the stunned champion, extending a weathered hand in congratulations for Sterling's own excellent performance. The gesture spoke volumes about the character that had been forged in the crucible of actual combat, where sportsmanship and respect for fellow warriors transcended competition and ego. "How?" Sterling asked, genuinely puzzled by what he had witnessed. "How did you do that with such old equipment?" Hank's answer was simple and profound. "This rifle and I have been through things together that you can't simulate on any range. We know each other completely. Your equipment is impressive, son. But it can't replace the kind of understanding that comes from depending on something when your life is on the line." The media descended upon the unlikely champion, eager to understand how a 78-year-old veteran had accomplished what seemed impossible. Hank's story began to emerge. The grandson of a World War I veteran, trained by his father who had been a professional gunsmith, shaped by combat experience that had taught him to read environmental conditions with an accuracy that no instrument could match. His rifle's history became equally fascinating to the gathered reporters. The Springfield M19903 had been manufactured in 1942, had served through some of the fiercest fighting in the European theater, and had been lovingly maintained by 3 generations of the Morrison family. Unlike the mass-produced weapons issued to most soldiers, this rifle had been individually crafted with the precision that only hand-fitting could achieve. Sterling's defeat was gracious but complete. His sponsors began to realize that their marketing emphasis on expensive equipment over fundamental skills might need reconsideration. Television interviews that evening focused not on the latest technological innovations, but on the timeless principles of marksmanship that Hank represented. The shooting community was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that modern equipment, for all its sophistication, could not replace the human elements of patience, experience, and intimate familiarity with one's tools. Hank's victory demonstrated that understanding your equipment completely was more valuable than owning the most expensive gear available. In the weeks that followed, Hank's story spread throughout the firearms community and beyond. Veterans organizations celebrated his achievement as validation of the skills and dedication that had won World War II. Shooting schools began to emphasize fundamental techniques over equipment purchases, recognizing that Hank's victory had exposed a dangerous trend toward technological dependence. The ancient Springfield was examined by firearms experts who marveled at its condition and precision. Despite its age, the rifle's bore remained perfectly straight, its action smooth and reliable, and its accuracy undiminished by decades of use. The careful maintenance it had received demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that modern shooters often overlooked in favor of simply buying newer equipment. Hank's victory also highlighted the difference between range shooting and combat marksmanship. While Sterling and his competitors had mastered the art of precision shooting under controlled conditions, Hank had learned to achieve accuracy under the worst possible circumstances. His ability to read wind and atmospheric conditions had been developed when German snipers were actively trying to kill him, creating a level of expertise that peaceful competition could never replicate. The record-setting shot at 1,163 yards became legendary within the shooting community, not just for its distance, but for what it represented. It proved that fundamental skills, properly developed and continuously practiced, could overcome any technological advantage. It demonstrated that experience and understanding were more valuable than equipment and theory. Sterling eventually became one of Hank's most ardent supporters, recognizing that his own skills had been enhanced by exposure to the veteran's techniques. He began studying historical marksmanship methods and incorporating traditional approaches into his modern training programs. His shooting academy added courses on environmental awareness and equipment familiarity that emphasized the principles Hank had demonstrated. The rifle itself became a symbol of American marksmanship tradition, representing the continuity between generations of shooters who had used similar weapons to defend freedom and achieve sporting excellence. Museums requested permission to display it, but Hank politely declined, explaining that the rifle was still being used for its intended purpose. Years later, when asked about the secret to his success, Hank would always return to the same fundamental truth. A rifle is only as good as the person holding it, and a person is only as good as their willingness to truly understand their tools. His victory had proven that the relationship between shooter and weapon transcended technology. That mastery came from dedication rather than expenditure. The 60-year record that fell that day in the Nevada desert represented more than just a sporting achievement. It symbolized the triumph of experience over innovation, wisdom over wealth, and character over technology. Hank Morrison had not just set a new shooting record, he had reminded an entire community that some things never become obsolete: skill, dedication, and the warrior's bond with his weapon. The old veteran passed away peacefully several years later, but his rifle remains in the family, maintained with the same careful attention that had made that historic shot possible. The record still stands, a testament to what can be achieved when human skill and mechanical precision combine in perfect harmony, guided by the kind of experience that can only be earned through service to something greater than oneself.